Thank you so much for being here today. We have a great session to learn more about what the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA have been up to in designing a national levee safety program, and also with updates to the National Levee Database. I'd like to thank our session sponsors before we get started. This is Jacobs. And I'm grateful today to be moderating this session with my colleagues. I had the privilege of working with them on this for about 7 months last year and this year. Since we only have 2 presentations for you this morning instead of 3, we've reserved about 15 minutes for question and answer after each presentation. So I encourage you to use the chat function to get those questions in. And now we will go to our first presentation. I'll introduce Tammy Comforti and Suzanne Vermeer. Tammy Comforti works with the Army Corps of Engineers, and she's worked with us for 29 years. In her current role as the Special Assistant for Levee Safety, Tammy's responsible for overseeing implementation of the agency's levee safety program, which means, among other responsibilities, leading the development and issuance of program policies. In her role, Tammy is also a technical advisor on a range of levee safety topics for the agency. She's responsible for building partnership, and she also prioritizes the Army Corps' levee safety program activities. In 2020, Tammy initiated efforts in partnership with Suzanne and FEMA to begin designing elements for a national levee safety program, which is the topic of today's discussion. Suzanne Vermeer works for FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and is a senior levee subject matter expert on understanding and communicating the risk associated with levees for the National Flood Insurance Program. She also leads FEMA's headquarters coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers to align our data sharing, risk communication, and national policy for levees, including the design and implementation of the National Levee Safety Program, what we'll be talking about today. Suzanne also worked with FEMA Region 5 in Chicago, and prior to that, she was a consulting engineer on projects around floodplain mapping, stormwater management, permitting, and plan review. She has background in design, survey, construction engineering services for both public and private sectors.
Hello, we're happy to be here today to be able to discuss the National Levee Safety Program. Here in part 1, we'll be talking about the general overview of this new program, along with some details about our approach to developing the key components over the next 3 or so years. This presentation is divided up into 6 sections shown here. I will cover the first 3, and then Suzanne will cover the last 3. So starting here with section 1, we're going to be talking about the opportunity we have here today before us. So why are we talking about a national levee safety program? It is not because of just one specific event like Hurricane Katrina or the 2019 Missouri River flooding. Frequent flood events continue to happen all around the country year after year. Flooding is consistently the most costly natural disaster we have to deal with in the United States, which keeps our attention on the issues and reminds us of the importance of levees. We're here because we as a community of practice has been studying how we can deal with flooding and better manage levees for over the past 75 years. Starting in 1936, the Flood Control Act is the start of the involvement by the federal government in dealing with flooding issues. Since then, we've been trying to figure out how to coexist with flooding. You have the Gilbert White report and his dissertation in 1945, basically creating the concept of floodplain management, promoting to how we can better live with flooding and not try to dominate it. And since then, over the years, there have been multiple national level reports conducted by various groups of diverse professionals. You have different task forces created by different administrations and other groups like the national academies, all looking at issues related to flooding and levees. And there are many more reports than just these shown here. So these reports are very important to remember because we want to learn from history and not repeat it. And there is one thing in common with all of these reports, the basic recommendations. So we may not yet have a unified approach to floodplain management that has always been envisioned in this country, but we certainly have unified recommendations. Generally, we know what should be done. For many years, we've all just been trying to figure out the best way of how to do these things. We have different tools that can make progress in these areas, and we just have to figure out how to be more effective in how we use those tools. So how do we better manage flooding? And more specifically, how can we better manage levees? All the recommendations in those national reports essentially fall into four basic themes. The first one is we need a consistent national approach to managing floodplains. There's a need for common goals, a better understanding of the trade-offs, a better balance. We need water, but it has to go somewhere. And we know that building higher levees is not a sustainable solution. And for levees, we know that they've been constructed and designed and managed all by various different entities using different processes and standards. The second main theme of recommendations is focused around improving public awareness and understanding of flood risk, really so we can all make better informed decisions. What's interesting is the term flood risk was in a lot of those older reports, even though today it feels like a new concept sometimes because it's so challenging to understand and to communicate. Many communities today that are behind levees still may not fully understand the benefits and the risk associated with their levees. The third set of recommendations or theme of recommendations fall into and relate to better awareness and understanding, but it all falls back on the basic need of having relevant and available data to make decisions. We've made a lot of progress already today in this area with levees with the National Levee Database. And the fourth recommendation is probably the hardest to solve. It's the clarification of roles and responsibilities among all levels of government. So all these different authorities can actually complement each other and not work against each other. And we all know that the responsibility of levees is currently distributed across all different levels of government. So the National Levee Safety Program offers a wonderful opportunity to help make progress in all four of these areas as they relate to levees. But before we can make progress with levees, we have to ensure that we always remember that decisions about levees can't be done in a vacuum. Levees and flood walls shown here are important to community safety and security, but they all exist in a bigger watershed and floodplain management system that all relies on the use of water for different purposes. Purposes like recreation, irrigation, water supply, and ecosystem restoration. This recognition is more important today than ever as we put more strain on the floodplains and we begin to better understand climate considerations. We all understand that decisions we make and actions we take today in the floodplain can have wider ranging impacts. So talking about the big opportunity we have before us, it's really been decades in the making. And we, the Corps of Engineers and FEMA, are committed to making this happen. We have initiated efforts to begin development of a national levee safety program shown here. With the Corps and FEMA as co-leads of this effort, it helps ensure the right blending of the expertise of our specific agencies. So the Corps of Engineers has a lot of great background, technical background related to levees. FEMA comes to the table with the knowledge and expertise in floodplain management. Both are needed for the development of this program. We also recognize the importance of the alignment of the National Levee Safety Program with two other programs, like the National Flood Insurance Program, which is led by FEMA. That program touches over 22,500 communities and is the source for federally backed flood insurance and floodplain regulations. And the other program is the National Dam Safety Program, also led by FEMA and heavily supported by the Corps of Engineers. And it touches 90,000 dams nationwide. Together, dams and levees play an important role in managing flood risk. These three national level programs working together can truly drive positive change in behaviors. There's already commonality between the objectives of these three programs, which are all focused on better managing flood risk. There is also another important aspect in common with all three of these programs. There's an intent on having the states be the key in implementation. States are already key in implementing the National Flood Insurance Program, and they're also key in the National Dam Safety Program. And when you look at the requirements for the National Levee Safety Program, it is also the intent there for states to have a key role. So many of you know that the Corps of Engineers has had for many years our own specific agency dam and levee safety programs. And as we move forward, we'll be able to link our own agency programs to be nested within these national programs, just as it would be the intent for other federal agencies and state programs as well. But our biggest opportunity we have before us is for the alignment of what's in the middle here. How do we bring together all our existing programs to better improve overall flood risk management? Both Corps and FEMA have programs today that encourage different actions, either proper operation and maintenance of levees or other sound floodplain management practices. But working in conjunction together will make all these existing programs more valuable and effective for local communities. So next, I'm going to cover the basic components of the National Levee Safety Program. So when we first got started, we began by spending a lot of time studying the legislative requirements. We knew it would be important to explain how all the different components are intended to work together and to develop them with that thought in mind. So this slide shows a draft set of initial programmatic objectives. Everything we've done to date, like drafting an initial vision or mission for the program and these objectives, will be vetted for feedback, but we thought it would be good to have an initial starting point for discussions. The objectives shown here are really tailored towards communities with levees and how the National Levee Safety Program is intended to support those communities. These objectives contain the essence of all four of those national recommendations: moving the nation towards a consistent approach for managing levees, better understanding of levees in the context of flood risk, providing information and tools to those who need it, and better understanding of roles and responsibilities as it relates to levees. So this slide shows the main components that we plan to deliver in the next 2 to 3 years that will serve as the long-term foundational resources for the program. So we'll first start with access to data to help guide better decisions. The National Levee Database is currently completed and available to the public today. And we have some assessment tools for inspections and risk assessments developed to be compatible with the database. As we move forward, we will continue to seek feedback on the National Levee Database to improve how that information can better be displayed and collected and managed in order to contribute the most value to the different decisions that need to be made. The next component is intended here to address the problem of the need for a consistent approach for levees. The National Levee Safety Guidelines is intended to be a reference resource available to everyone that includes the best consistent national practices for the life cycle of a levee, such as defining if you even need a levee and including best practices for design, construction, and the long-term management of a levee. It is an intent that the guidelines include how levees should be considered in a broader risk management context as well, including having information about evacuation planning, risk communication, and potentially land use practices. So the third component of the National Levee Safety Program is shown here. And this component is related to how do we best encourage the on-the-ground implementation of the National Levee Safety Guidelines. And our thought is they get implemented on the ground through formal levee safety programs by the entities that have the authorities to manage a portfolio of levees within their areas of responsibilities. So that would be typically federal agencies, states, and tribes. So it would be very similar to the levee safety program that the Corps has or some of the programs that states already have. So the main third key deliverable here is to provide and develop a set of model activities for the governance and oversight of levees by those entities, which are federal, state, and tribes, that we want to promote to have more formal levee safety programs. So another key element as we move forward to develop this program is focusing on better understanding of the different roles that different organizations have with levees. So currently the management of levees, we know across the U.S. is somewhat piecemealed and disconnected. And over the next few years, we want to engage stakeholders and try to better clarify a common understanding of the different roles and responsibilities and how these roles can be complementary with each other. In some cases, we've seen there may be overlap. For example, you have different kinds of plans that are being created at different levels intended to promote the same set of activities or programs. So for example, like hazard mitigation plans or floodplain management plans or even emergency action plans. And if these plans aren't coordinated amongst the different levels, sometimes it could lead to being inefficient and confusing and could cause conflicts. And there are other cases across the nation where we have gaps of oversight. There are some levees that no longer have an identified owner that is managing them. But bottom line, there's room for improvement and understanding. And knowing what each entity's role is in flood risk management and levee safety is going to be the only way we can move forward effectively. So in this section, I'm going to briefly cover our overall approach to developing the program over the next few years. So this slide shows principles. Basically, it describes the how the Corps of Engineers and FEMA intend to approach the development of the program. This is what you can expect from us. We promise that we are going to strive to achieve what best serves the nation and the needs of those intended to use the program. We're going to promote open dialogue and partnerships and transparent communication as we move forward. And we're going to strive to ensure that program resources are accessible to those socially vulnerable and underserved populations. But as you can see, this program is super complicated, and the development of this program is going to require a substantial stakeholder engagement strategy. We are not dictating the requirements. We have been entrusted to be the leaders in facilitating a national dialogue to develop the program with stakeholder feedback as we go. So expectations about how we plan to engage stakeholders and what we intend to do with their input is going to be critical to be clear about up front to set the right expectations and that we're consistent in how we talk about it throughout the process. Ultimately, the Corps of Engineers and FEMA, we have the responsibility for the final decisions, but we have to consider a variety of input from so many stakeholders and make the decisions that best serves the program's objectives. We intend to have, as part of the stakeholder engagement, a dedicated federal advisory board shown here. And we hope to use the one that already exists, the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force. And we also intend to have a dedicated complementary non-federal advisory group shown here. And this group is the Committee on Levee Safety. And that Committee on Levee Safety is required in the legislation, which is the National Levee Safety Act for this program. And we will have very well-defined roles and expectations articulated for each of those two groups. But from there, we will also be implementing a spectrum of other stakeholder activities. We've adopted the International Association for Public Participation tool, and we'll be clear on when we plan to do one-way communication of just providing updates and status updates, and we'll also be very clear on when we have other levels of engagement like consult, involve, and collaborate, where there's more increased engagement. Consult, involve, and collaborate, we anticipate will be our main levels of engagement throughout the development of this program. So now I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Tammy. Next, we'll talk about the key deliverables. And when we use that phrase, we're talking about the most durable products that Tammy mentioned earlier on the building block slide. These are the products that will support this effort in the long term. And as part of this, we'll clarify and talk through our initial assumptions and highlight some limitations that we face. Next slide. One of the key components is to establish national levee safety guidelines, which will be a common set of practices for those levee owners, communities, private sector, federal, state, regional, tribal organizations, and it helps improve the predictability of levee performance if we have a national set of common guidelines. It also assists with flood risk management activities for communities and will help to measure progress of those efforts over time. And these could be used in all phases of a levee life cycle, from design and construction all the way through management over the long term to improve flood risk management across the nation. Next slide. We're assuming these guidelines will be voluntary and available for all to use. And we'll focus on organizing them by the different roles entities have in support of operating and managing levees and floodplain emergency management in the country. We anticipate publishing the first set of guidelines in 2023 or 2024, and that schedule will be aligned with the other program components that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. We'll update these and improve them over time based on feedback and technical advancements, and they'll be adaptable to a variety of conditions across the nation. Next slide. The second component is to establish a model levee safety program that will encourage these states, regions, tribes, and federal entities to understand and manage their levees and the levee safety program according to that common set of guidelines. So as Tammy mentioned earlier, we'll provide model programs and examples that are consistent across the nation, but can also be scalable in order to meet the needs of the more regional or local entities. And these can be used as a reference for incentives as well. We'll include oversight and management activities that will result in an effective levee safety program at all these various levels of government. Next slide. As a precursor to this effort, federal agencies began working together to determine what a common set of federal guidelines should look like. And those are different than what a national program might look like. But we will consider what was developed in a draft form at the federal level. We'll consider that as we work to develop these state, tribal, and regional programs. And because this is a voluntary program, we must make sure that the requirements on states are minimal during the stand-up portion. We want to get states started on the effort and help them see a benefit and take small steps to get started. So we can build performance-based incentives as we go along, but the critical first step is really just to make this scalable in order to get the states and others to get their foot in the door to get started on developing their own programs. And Congress authorized also a grant program to assist states in standing up their programs, states or tribes. And there's a formula that's based on the miles of levees, so it recognizes the different levels of program needs across the country. And we also need to consider how we engage tribes. Not all tribes have levees on their tribal land, and they likely have very different needs and priorities than other entities such as states or regions. So we'll conduct extensive outreach to the tribes to best understand their needs. Next slide. The third component is to establish a national levee database. And as Tammy mentioned, we've made much progress on that over the past several years. The NLD, National Levee Database, provides up-to-date information on levees across the nation. And FEMA and the Army Corps use that and consider that the authoritative source of data for levees in the nation and the locations of levees. It's used by multiple different entities, including levee owners and states and others to store and manage their data. And it also can be combined with other data sets to support flood risk management decisions and other activities. It's also compatible with other tools, particularly those for inspections and data collection. And it's more important than anything, I think, for a lot of the public, it's a resource to help communicate flood risk. And we know that particularly during flood events, we know the media often is quoting information that is available publicly on the National Levee Database. And there's a lot of really useful information that we do see publicly shared, particularly during those flood events. And the bottom line is that moving forward, we'll focus on continuously improving the data in the National Levee Database, developing smart business processes to update and improve that data quality over time. And we want to make this information more useful to all flood risk managers. So we kind of look at it as this continuous improvement process with the National Levee Database. Next slide. So as I mentioned, FEMA and the Corps are committed to using the NLD as their single source of levee data to inform both of our programs for levee that involve levees. And we recognize that because this data is available publicly, it does provide users with an understanding of not just the risks, but also the benefits of specific levee systems. And so it's also an investment at the levee owner level, levee sponsor level to understand and help to inform information in the National Levee Database in partnership with the Corps. And it also includes risk assessment tools that and the functionality in order to interface those tools with the National Levee Database. It's a complex framework. We do know that sometimes some of the changes we've seen over time that we've been requested to make are kind of challenging, but the bottom line is that we've made tremendous strides to improve the usability of the National Levee Database and certainly the accessibility of levee data and the functionality of the NLD. Next slide. And finally, we'll highlight activities that the Corps and FEMA will do to support the National Levee Safety Program. So to make all of this work together, the Corps and FEMA recognize that in addition to FEMA grant assistance to states and tribes to help establish their own levee safety programs, there will be a need for training and tool development and technical assistance, and certainly program improvements over time. This slide highlights some examples for each of those activities. As we work to develop the key deliverables mentioned earlier, we will identify areas that are most in need of support and will work to fill those needs. We recognize this is an ongoing need to continue to support the implementation of those deliverables. And again, the deliverables are the National Levee Safety Guidelines, the Model Levee Safety Program, and the National Levee Database. So as we continue to support the implementation, we'll approach that through these various activities here to ensure that we're meeting the intent of the National Levee Safety Program for the nation. And with that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
I'm just going to start with some of the most popular ones. First question is for Tammy, coming from Susan Gilson. When do you anticipate that the National Levee Safety Committee non-federal advisory group will be stood up?
Great question, and hello everyone. I'm happy to be here, and I want to apologize for no video. My camera chose to go bad like right before this session, so but I promise I am smiling at the camera and happy to be here. So thank you for that question, Susan. So yes, we're developing the approach on how we want to stand up the Committee on Levee Safety. We're still doing some internal discussions on those approaches. We have, as you know, new leadership coming on board, and the Committee on Levee Safety membership has to be appointed by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. So we're trying to develop the background information and the discussion that we want to have with the office in order to prepare to proceed with moving forward with the Committee on Levee Safety. So it's in the works, and we're planning on doing that. So hopefully when we get a more definitive timeline, we'll be able to make a more definitive announcement.
Thanks, Tammy. Okay, next, Molly asks, you mentioned that FEMA and the Army Corps won't own this program. So ultimately, once all of the guidelines are out, will everyone self-manage or self-certify? How will this affect mapping levees and the LAMP program? A couple of questions in there.
And I can start? Yeah, sure. So the basis of the National Levee Safety Program and the materials we're developing is really meant to be more in a support role. So the program itself is not mandatory or regulatory, but it's meant to provide guidance documents, templates, training, and alignment of requirements of existing programs in order to support really people that have an interest in levees. And I forgot part of the question. There was a question about self-regulating. Yes. We know there's a wide variety of roles and responsibilities that have to do with levees. And so the materials that will be developed under the program, those, could be picked, you can pick and choose what reference documents and what training or templates or other things that can be used based on the roles and responsibilities of each of the variety of users.
Yeah, and I think the question about certifying, I'm assuming, may be connected to accreditation. We can say with the National Levee Safety Program, and at this time, FEMA has no proposed changes to our levee accreditation process, the criteria set forth in 44 CFR 6510. It is important to note that, we do have, FEMA has the requirement to identify flood hazards, and flood risk associated with levees. We identify that on our flood insurance rate maps, and certainly there are other requirements in statute to identify residual risk and areas of inundation behind levees. So all of that information is still critical to provide to communities to support flood risk management.
Thanks, Suzanne and Tammy. Next, how will the National Levee Safety Guidelines play well with other Army Corps levee guidance documents like EM 1110-2-1913, Design and Construction of Levees?
So yeah, a great question. So all the guidance documents in the publication that the Corps of Engineers has for our own agency, of course, were developed to meet our own needs, whether it's the needs of our programs or the different authorities that we have. The National Levee Safety Program and the guidelines is different. The needs of those guidelines really have to meet the needs of a wide variety of users that are out there. So whether it's a levee owner, an emergency manager, or the private sector. So what, our intent is to do a lot of stakeholder engagement. And in developing the guidelines, I think we'll have a lot of things we can put forward as initial thoughts, what topics to cover, what type of content is needed. Of course, the Corps has a lot of experience with our own technical guidance documents. I think in a lot of cases, the content of those can serve as maybe a starting point, but the things that we currently have in the Corps can certainly be adapted or changed to meet the needs of a broader group of stakeholders.
Thanks, Tammy. Next, Al Goodman mentions that the CRS activity 620, which is around levee activities, will probably be modified or updated in the next CRS coordinators manual. Have you considered perusing the current manual and submitting input to FEMA's CRS task force for any recommended future changes? The Army Corps does have a representative on the task force.
Yes, and FEMA certainly has representatives as well. So that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. As part of the National Levee Safety Program design, we are engaging multiple entities, certainly various connections to other programs within FEMA and the Corps to leverage other opportunities to help increase opportunities, incentives to build resilience across the nation. So engaging the CRS team and task force is certainly part of that, that approach.
Thank you. Let me get to the next one. Nadine Wadsworth asks, how will you be coordinating with the states, and when will more information on these processes become available?
Again, thank you for that question. It's a great question. So what we've been working on is developing our basic schedule and stakeholder engagement plan and over the past few months. Because the National Levee Safety Program has so many different components, we want to make it as efficient as possible when we reach out to stakeholders. So, we're not one day asking about a chapter in the guidelines and then the next day asking about what do you think of these model programs. So we're still building that schedule, but we hope by early fall, we will be able to make some kind of public announcement. We'll get the word out through all the associations. We'll develop a public website where we'll be posting, our intent and expectations on how we can get people engaged. We know we have to have a dedicated engagement with the states because the states are going to have a very important role in this program. So we'll further develop targeted activities or engagement opportunities really geared towards state representatives as well, because we know we want to have that special dedicated engagement with the state.
Thank you. Joy Brooks asks, how should levees not included in the database be reported or submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers?
Awesome question. And if you're hanging in for the rest of this session, our next session will talk about the National Levee database, and they will cover that as well. But in short, on the National Levee database website, there is a page with a help email address and a way to send an email through the National Levee database, and someone will reach out to you if you have information. And we're looking for that information. So it would be great if you did that. And also, if you have a relationship with your local Corps of Engineers district, you can also reach out to them. So either of those two ways.
Thank you, Tammy. Next, Dan Korf asks, how will the data be collected for the levees? Will it be taken from the Army Corps annual inspections? Will it be collected by Army Corps staff, by private contractors?
I love all these questions. They're awesome. So, yes. So as you know, in the National Levee database, we've done a lot of collection of information already on the levees that are under a Corps of Engineers authority. What we plan to do for the remaining levees is most likely we will utilize private sector contractors to collect that work. Is what we're thinking. And what we're doing right now is developing scalable approaches for the levees, because we want to right size our level of effort. There's a lot of structures identified now out there. Some of them we may have been identified as a levee, but really not a levee. So we have some validation to do on some of the data, but we know that there are some robust levees out there that we would expect that we would have to go on site to try to collect that information. And it would be a combination of going on site, working with the levee owners, of course, and making sure we're collecting the best information that we can.
Great, thank you. One question that the team actually has for the audience, and so we encourage you to put your answers in the chat and we can review them a little bit later, is what specific topics do you all think should be covered in the National Levee Safety Guidelines? And feel free to just go ahead, put those in the chat, and we'll save them in the archive so that our group can look at it a little bit later on. Another question is participation in the National Levee Safety Program required?
So no, the program itself and the components of the program are meant to be more of a support role. So the program is intended to develop things like the guidelines, training, public awareness. So we look forward to working and getting that feedback on what are the needs out there that are related to levees that can help, a variety of stakeholders and different levels of government kind of meet the needs of the goals that we want to jointly develop for the program. And those goals will likely be tailored towards, a better understanding of levees, a more common framework for managing levees across the nation.
Thank you. And if we still have a couple more minutes, there's a couple more questions. How will this program change or impact other programs like PL 8499 or the National Flood Insurance Program?
I can start with, I was going to say, there are, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's a great question that we're still exploring, leveraging potential existing programs within FEMA and drawing those connections. A couple examples are certainly the National Dam Safety Program. There are a lot of things that we've learned through the implementation of the National Dam Safety Program. We've got a lessons learned document that FEMA and the Corps worked to put together. So we're building those lessons learned in as we design the National Levee Safety Program. But we also want to make sure that some of those requirements for the National Dam Safety Program, that we can kind of mirror those eligibility requirements for the National Levee Safety Program, so that there's not different competing requirements or inconsistent requirements we also see a direct connection to certainly mitigation planning. And so we're working with our mitigation planners to make sure that any of those requirements there are aligned between these different programs. And I think we mentioned CRS. There's other, looking at potentially connections to other various FEMA programs within the NFIP as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Tammy, to talk about core programs.
No, I think you covered it well. We're looking forward because to this development of the National Levee Safety Program is an opportunity to align our, existing programs between core and FEMA, just like Suzanne says. So, and the goal of doing that is to help reduce redundancy. So, for example, there's some programs that will say need a floodplain management plan, for example, or a hazard mitigation plan. And it's really an opportunity to align, well, what are those requirements? Can we make them the same plan? And it's really just to make things a little bit more efficient for those who want to take advantage or benefit from some of the existing programs that we have.
Thanks, Tammy. Well, thank you both very much, Tammy and Suzanne, for this presentation, and thanks everyone for all of your great questions. I'm sure this will be a ongoing discussion in the future. Now we need to move to our next presentation, also in this subject area. So we will be hearing from Michael Gonia and Brian VanBockern. Brian VanBockern is a data management branch chief with the Army Corps of Engineers Dam and Levee Safety Program. He's also a technical dam and levee subject matter expert, where he develops and implements applications, data strategies, and technology support for the National Levee Database and other related applications. Brian has been a disaster response senior analyst on hurricane and flood fighting activities and he's supported over 20 major events in the last 5 years. He's also a disaster response trainer and exercise planner for domestic and international events, including work in over 15 countries. Most recently, he's been leading the efforts to redesign the National Levee Database and the levee inspection system to expand data management capabilities and collaborate with partners like FEMA on various levee and dam safety activities. We also have Michael Gonia. He is a levee safety technical advisor with the Army Corps' Levee Safety Center. Michael has over a decade of experience in inspection, assessment, design, construction, and operation of levee systems. He holds an undergraduate civil engineering degree from Gonzaga and a master's in geotechnics from Missouri University of Science and Technology. Looking forward to your presentation now.
Hello, my name is Brian VanBockern. I work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And today, myself and Michael Gonia will be presenting you a briefing on the National Levee Safety Program's data strategy and the National Levee Database. I'd like to spend some time going through several sections of this briefing to kind of go over the basics of the National Levee Database and discuss what's in the database itself with a discussion of the inventory, and then walk through some data improvement initiatives. And finally, end with some question and answers with the audience. So getting into the National Levee Database basics, what is this database and what does it comprise of? The vision for the National Levee Database is to serve as a single reliable source for levee information that can be used for a variety of purposes. Serving the public, making relevant information available to assist decision makers, and how the levee integrates within the communities, and help states in statewide hazard mitigation and other emergency planning efforts. Also improves an understanding of the level of importance of levees as important critical infrastructure to the nation. Because of advancements in technology and being compatible with other data collection and assessment tools, the National Levee Database gives us a platform to integrate data from lots of sources and stakeholders. It also serves other relevant programs, such as the National Flood Insurance Program, and informs those programs with better and enhanced data to make risk-informed decisions. As mentioned before, this provides us a big opportunity as we develop the National Levee Safety Program to align these three national programs to help drive positive change in flood risk management. This includes better alignment of information between the agencies, and technology now allows us to combine and overlay many different flood risk sources and other data sources from the FEMA flood insurance maps and lots of other sources of information across the dam and levee infrastructure. Also, in the months ahead, we're going to release a new national inventory dams, which will mirror kind of the capability that's in the National Levee Database with similar tools and content. This slide shows some screenshots of the main 3 applications that we have in our levee safety toolbox. Obviously, the National Levee Database serves as the clearinghouse of information and assimilates information from the levee inspection system and levee screening tool. The inspection system is a field mobile device gathering system to go out and inspect levees using a set checklist of rated items. The levee screening tool is a risk assessment tool that allows us to perform risk analysis. And all these data endpoints integrate with each other and roll up into the National Levee Database as that public viewing portal. So let's take a look at what's inside the NLD today. So where did all this information come from? You know, we have well over 7,000 levee systems in the NLD today, and it came from a couple myriad of sources, primarily from the basis of the USACE systems, but also the FEMA mapping effort for the flood insurance maps, and additional state and federal levies that were sent in as part of data calls and inventory efforts in the last few years. These provide the foundations of levies in the NLD today. So what's some critical information? What's behind our levies? Well, we use a lot of tools, and we use the levied area polygons behind the levies to kind of derive what the consequences may be. So we use the National Structures Inventory as a national data set, which has a basis in the old FEMA HAZAS data set. And by running these analytics, we can see we have a significant consequence behind these levies involving over 16 million people and $2 trillion worth of buildings and contents. But not all levies are created equal. This graph highlights that 25% of the levies in the NLD contain roughly 80% of the consequences. A lot of levies are agricultural in nature and provide key protection to crops and other non-economic items that don't involve structures or buildings or life safety. But these 25% of the levies really do protect the bulk of the consequences within the nation. So I'm going to take a moment here to do a quick demonstration within the National Levee Database of some data mining exercises and some key tools that will help the user find information and discover what's available in the National Levee Database. So transitioning here to the website, I'll highlight some key navigation and data mining functions to help users find data that they need to answer questions and support analytics. From the homepage, you'll immediately see a search bar where you can do intelligent searches and typing in of names, locations, communities to find information quickly and rapidly. So in this case, I'm going to say my question is to find some information about East St. Louis levees. And if you don't know the levee system name, you can just type in a location of a city. And the system will auto-populate with suggested returns of information. And in this case, I'm just going to select East St. Louis, Illinois. The system then does a spatial query within the database and returns the systems that intersect that city boundary. In this case, we have 4 systems falling within East St. Louis's bounds. The system in question I wanted to examine is the Chain of Rocks system, a very high-risk system that we have in the Illinois inventory. As a user clicks on a system, it dives deeper into the system's details, and these pages provide a litany of information about this structure, including its characteristics, its location, the risk associated with it, and a deep dive into the features of the system. As a user navigates left to right across the tabs, they will explore all kinds of additional information about this levee system. As a user moves from systems to segments, the systems being the overall portion of the levee, the segments being individual pieces that are owned by certain entities, where the levee is broken up into pieces. Under each segment, you'll have additional information. The risk tab provides the consequences that are behind that levee and a description of some of the performance and lost benefit issues associated with it. FEMA accreditation is also tracked in the NLD. In this case, we have an accredited system, so it has a FEMA flood insurance status in terms of homeowners that need to have insurance behind this levee. Another key tab is the features tab. This allows the users to start to look at the levee and its individual components. In this case, we'll highlight how a user can turn on a flood walls, and you can see in yellow along the line of the levee protection where the flood walls are located. A user can also turn on and off columns to highlight a whole host of additional information about the levee and the features associated with it. Not all levees are created equal in the NLD. Some have a rich data set, while others are still maturing. But this information is all displayed throughout a series of these tabs. The profile tab is the top of levee information that's displayed to the public. And lastly, the attachments tab involves any public-facing documents that a user can download. In this case, we have a levee system summary available for this system because of its risk level. And this document is developed by the Corps of Engineers for our levees that provides a nice overview of the levee and its risk characterizations and risk items that individuals can use for informational purposes. So one thing I wanted to highlight on these panels is all throughout the site, you will see the download data button. What this allows a user to do is download the data in various formats to do analytics on their desktop. You do not have to use the website to do all the informational gathering. You're able to offload this into Excel, Google Earth, and spatial formats as a user needs. So let's show another data mining technique. I'm going to go back to the home page. And if a user doesn't want to just search for an individual levee or community or state or use any of the navigation tools on the home page, they can also jump to the advanced search function. What this does is give the user ability on the left-hand side to add filters. In the upper left, you'll see the add filter button. This allows users to bring in additional filtering items within the navigation so that they can query on these and shorten their list. So the data mining elements generally for filtering will allow the user to add these to the list. We will quickly clear our items, and what we want to search for here is we added the system's flood source. So we're going to search and see if we can find levees in the Missouri River. So by searching our flood source, you have 192 systems found that have the Missouri River listed as a flood source, and you can see these items highlighted in red on the map. So a user can go through this list here and select or navigate within the map panel to show some items. But say we wanted to go a little further and you wanted to find out which levees on the Missouri River have flood walls with an eyewall type. So I'll go to the flood walls item here and add this. Then if you scroll down, you will find wall types. So I'll add that. So as your filter list on the left-hand side builds, I added this at the bottom, and I'm going to see how many levees have eye walls. So if I query that out, I end up with four systems that have eye wall types on them, if those are of interest to certain questions. So you can go in here, and again, you're back to the system view, go to features, flood walls, and you can see where these eye walls are located. You can just add the column and add the wall type to ensure that all of them are that. So one's a couple are eye walls, you do have a T wall mixed in. So that shows the most common features for searching and navigating data. One last item I'd like to highlight is our web services. If folks do not want to use the National Levee Database but want to use the data, they're able to ingest the data through services. We have two methods to get data in and out. The WebGIS service. This involves an Esri REST endpoint and an open source endpoint. This is for the mapping data. Users can use these URLs, they're public facing, and it serves out all the mapping data available in the NLD. We also have JSON API endpoints for developers. This allows a user to come in and get various portions of the business data in the tables out through web services where they can bring them into their own applications. And this is all live linked in the master database as it's being updated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Gonia, who will take us through the last sections of the briefing.
Thank you, Brian. As Brian mentioned, my name is Michael Gonia. I'm also with the Army Corps of Engineers. Brian just completed the overview of the National Levee Database. Now I'm going to transition to discussing the current and future data improvements the Corps and FEMA are working on. In section 2, Brian discussed the origins of the current inventory and the varying quality and completeness of that information. For example, for levees where the Corps completed inspections and risk assessments, we conducted detailed field surveys, collected historical data, and refined NLD data during that process. This group of levees has high quality data. For many of the other levees, that is not the case. In sections 4 and 5, I'll be discussing our current and future actions to continue to improve the quality of data on the remaining levee systems to get a more complete and reliable picture of the nation's levees. So why do we care so much about collecting particular data on levees? The short answer is that some very basic data, when combined and used correctly, can tell us quite a bit about the importance of the levees in the United States and what is at stake should they not function as we expect. Our goal for the National Levee Database is a consistent nationwide database of levee information that supports a common understanding of levee benefits and risks. Before transitioning to our data collection approach and improvement efforts, I would like to quickly review the major components of risk estimate that drives what data we have found is important. So risk is a function of 3 components as you're seeing on the screen: hazard, performance, and consequence. All variables must be calculated, measured in some way. The quality of the data for each of these components affects the quality of the risk estimate. Good data equals a more reliable estimate. So starting with the hazard, it's all about the flood loading. Where are the sources of flooding? How long will the water be on the levee? How likely is that water will overtop the levee? The second variable is performance. It's tied to how the levee will respond given that loading. Does the levee have any deficiencies? How likely are those deficiencies to make the levee breach? Will the levee breach if overtopped? Condition information is chiefly gathered through visual inspections in the field and historic performance documentation. Finally, consequence is the who and the what that reside behind the levee. If they get wet, what is the likely impact? Population structures, critical infrastructure, regional economic drivers are identified to be in the area behind the levee that might get flooded. Then we want to better understand the possible loss of life, damage to buildings and critical infrastructure, and other community-specific impacts. Next slide. So this slide describes our general plan for refining and improving data in the National Levee Database. Step 1 is to refine the key geospatial data, and step 2 is to seek national level risk estimates, and where useful, detailed information about risk, using the data that we refined in step 1. The starting point on the left is the National Levee Database. All data being refined is sourced from the existing NLD. The middle column shows the types of geospatial data we are focusing refinement efforts on, which include the levee alignment, the levee profile, and the levied area. Each geospatial piece of information builds on the previous as indicated by the white arrows. This diagram also draws linkages to the key component of risk we discussed on the previous slide. In particular, an accurate levee profile is needed to yield an estimate of the likelihood that the levee will overtop. And a precise levied area makes all future description of people and property consequences more precise. The The remaining key component of risk, performance, as shown in the orange box, is still needed, but is part of our next data collection push, which I'll be discussing more in section 5 of this presentation. Next slide. Now that the general procedural overview and general connection to the risk information is understood, I want to step back and define the 3 key geospatial data. Refer to the figure at the top of the page indicating a generic levee system. You have water surface profiles, a levee crest profile, and levied area. The levee alignment is the location on the levee in plan view, really the X and Y, which is simple enough. However, one of the more important aspects of the levee alignment and an emphasis as we refine the data is identifying all parts of the levee system. Does the levee tie into high ground? Does it rely on a railroad or roadway embankment to exclude water from the floodplain along with the levee? All system features excluding water from the floodplain are necessary in defining the levied area and ultimately the risk to the community. The levee profile is the crest elevations along the entire length of the alignment. It's the Z values. Both the levee alignment and levee profile geospatial representations of what is physically present in the world. The third element, the levied area, is a little unique, so let's dive a little deeper on the next slide. What is the levied area? That's a good question. The nomenclature is somewhat unique to the core and the National Levee Database, so we'd like to explain a little more detail on what it is, and maybe more importantly, what it is not. From a definition standpoint, the levied area is the lands from which floodwater is excluded by the levee system for an event equal to the top of the levee. Some could call it a protected area, but we usually don't like that because the word protected, because flood events exceeding the height of the levee could happen. The levied area polygon can be developed from different levels of rigor, from approximate to terrain-based approaches to those developed from hydraulic modeling. Different techniques are better suited for some applications than others. For example, flood fill, which was used to develop the levied area in the image to the right, sets a single low point elevation along the levee crest, and GIS techniques generate a polygon over areas with a lower elevation. This simulates ponding like a bathtub. This technique generally only works well in relatively flat areas. A more popular method we use seeks to project the levee profile into the floodplain until high ground is reached, a process we have termed the profile projection method. So let's discuss a little bit now what the levied area is not. The levied area is a good place to start for consideration of emergency planning. However, levied areas will not give you detailed information about inundation for use during a particular event, nor will it tell you where the levee might breach. In practice, modeling and levee breach analysis is done to develop detailed inundation mapping for emergency action plans. The levied area is also not the same as a FEMA special flood hazard area used for NFIP purposes, which is only focused on showing areas of 1% chance flooding. The levied area shows the area that could be flooded for an event equal to the top of the levee and is not necessarily tied to a specific flood flow or recurrence. Next slide. Okay, so this slide introduces in more detail what the Corps and FEMA are doing to improve the data right now so we can build risk information in the future. We have set a target data quality standard for refinement of the data. We know from USACE experience that field survey quality data collection is expensive and time consuming. So we have set a more achievable target of using a terrain-based GIS method in combination with high quality digital elevation models, DEMs, with a minimum of 3-meter resolution to refine levee alignment, profile, and levied area. The GIS tools that we're using help us derive more consistent and accurate geospatial data. We're working first in densely populated areas as designated by structure count because we know that a vast majority of the people and property are behind a small percentage of the levee system. Next slide. This desktop refinement effort is incredibly valuable in that it can quickly and relatively inexpensively give us a baseline set of information for all levees in the National Levee Database. That said, it can only take us so far. The nationwide repository of high-quality LiDAR is currently incomplete. Approximately 20% of our levee systems cannot be refined to the target data quality standard due to lack of high-quality DEM. Furthermore, floodwall enclosure features part of the levee system are typically not visible in the DEM, so that's a limitation. Complex systems require local knowledge to understand how various features interact and function to reduce flood risks. And finally, as mentioned previously, terrain-based spatial analysis methods are not appropriate for all levee system types. For example, unbounded, really steep terrain flood runout really requires a higher standard, needing flow and time variables included in hydraulic breach modeling to define the levied area accurately. Next slide. Now we're going to be going into section 5, which is going to be focused on what are we doing next to improve the data. Next slide. In support of the National Levee Safety Program, we intend to collect basic information on levees so we can better understand their impact on flood risk. This can provide a consistent baseline of risk to understand national investments, inform risk communication and risk management actions by owners and communities, and be helpful to states in setting up the state levee safety programs. The data refinement we're currently doing will springboard into collecting additional levee-specific risk information. This may involve field inspection and risk assessments as needed to quantify the risk. As a callback to a previous slide, this is really that orange performance box that we talked about, which is needed to round out the risk equation. We are still in the process of developing the scope of this national levee review using information we've learned from our previous efforts. Let's go on to the next slide. So this details more of our approach for the national effort to learn more about levees. So first step, we want to focus on partnering. Participation of the local levee owner in the collection of data, inspection, and risk assessment has been incredibly valuable for the completeness and accuracy of the data thus far, and helps us on our way of achieving the true goal, which is to communicate risk and exchange information about risk management options. Number 2 is scalability. One size doesn't fit all. And to be a good steward of taxpayer dollars, the collection and assessment of levees should match the intended use and value added to the information collected. Third, prioritization. We're going to have to prioritize. Our plan is to provide more detailed levee-specific analysis for high-risk areas and to those data managers in a position to use it. Fourth is our approach will need to consider the utility of the info. The Corps is only authorized to do a one-time assessment. Since risk must be periodically assessed, the techniques, cost, and capability are all factors we need to consider. It must be able to be relatively easily repeated in the future. Finally, we want to seek opportunities to better streamline our processes for collecting information and assessing levees by continuing to seek innovative methods. Next slide. So how can you help build the National Levee data set for levees? Please visit the National Levee database and review the data. If you have information on a particular levee, please contact us via the 2 options shown on the screen. First, the NLD team has an email and a phone available. And second, you can contact your local USACE district for support. Next slide. In closing, FEMA and USACE have made significant progress to share levee-related information with each other and with the public that helps increase the nation's understanding of flood risk behind levees. Data refinement of key geospatial information, namely the levee alignment, profile, and levied area, sets us up for completing a baseline risk estimate for all levees in the nation. As we continue our efforts, the National Levee Safety Program will be designed around the various needs, roles, and responsibilities of diverse levee stakeholders. A complete data set is foundational to effective flood risk management. A consistent nationwide data set opens the door for usage of graduated risk to build actuarially sound flood insurance rates. And it also opens up the door for implementation of statutory requirements of the Bigger Waters Act of 2012 by identifying areas of residual risk and inundation. This concludes part 2 of the presentation, and we encourage questions and discussion for Brian or I. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian and Michael, for that great presentation. We have a handful of great questions, and I will get started. So Joy Brooks has a note just for consideration for the team. She says the danger of historic non-engineered levees and small rural and how small rural communities can manage their risk without many resources that should be included in considerations of the National Levee Safety Program. But then more specifically, some questions. Perry Turk asks, what type of technical information, for example, as-built, general historic data, O&M plans, EAPs, inspection reports, etc., will be available through the National Levee database once the system is updated?
I can go ahead and take that one, Jessica. Thank you for the question. The National Levee database currently has locations to house all that information. It's incumbent upon the levee sponsor and or the hosting USACE district to populate that information. So we have the ability to upload O&M manuals, EAPs, and other technical documentation and data. So it's really just levee by levee dependent upon the data managers to upload that information.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey, this is Tammy. Just for clarification for the audience, though, that it's not the intent for those materials to be publicly available. Is that correct?
Some of those documents can be publicly available, some are not. Inspection reports are not publicly available. EAPs can be. It's really a decision made by the data owner.
Okay. So next, Diana asks, knowing that a structure has been previously vetted and determined to not meet the criteria of a levee is valuable information for mapping partners. Where can this information be obtained?
I'll jump first on it. So as we recategorize levees, part of the reviews, we're going to make data locations available for, say, channels and or other FRM structures. And we will probably control that data for specific partners, but we will not obviously remove the data. We're just going to move it into different data buckets so that we can visualize it and do analysis separately with it. And that's all future endeavors that we're making plans for now in the system. And Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything further on that.
No, Brian, I think you covered that. I would just maybe give an example. So as we're taking a look at certain features, we're making a decision whether things are channels or canals or levees, and we're making updates to the National Levee database. So that information can be reflected. Those updates will be reflected in the National Levee database. So that will still be our top source for finding out information on a particular levee that you're interested in.
Thank you. Roger Colwell asks, is there a standard software or application being utilized throughout the Army Corps to inspect levees today? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, Jessica, I'll take that one. Thank you for the question. Yes, there is a standard software. The levee inspection system has been in existence for almost 15 years. It started as a desktop software program, but that has been retired in the last 18 months. We now have an Android application that's available off the website. If you go to the More menu off the NLD and go to the inspections area, you'll see the Android levee inspection system available to load. We're working on an Apple version right now and hope to have it deployed later this summer. And those will be our standard applications moving forward with the checklists, and it has full connectivity back to the NLD. Folks are able to use other third-party software if necessary. We can provide the data model and they could build it out in, say, some of the Esri tools or Trimble or Fulcrum. We could help advise on that if folks kind of want to go down that route for levee inspections too.
Someone named Christian asks, will the database contain only the most recent levee profile, or will it still contain all historic profiles as well?
Jessica, I'll take that one. Currently, the NLD reflects the current levee profile as provided by the data owner. We do not provide multiple profiles to the public users. However, we will have that capability for private use analytics in the future.
Thank you. Someone named Jamie asks, without having an account, I do not see a way to develop a one-page summary report for each levee. Is that a feature that would be considered? This will be helpful when communicating levees to local community and levee owners.
I'll take a first stab at this one, and Tammy, you might need to help clarify, but no, we do not. We have certain report builder functions in the NLD for authorized users that generate forms and outputs like the levee inspection report. And we do have a system summary generator. The system summary template is still undergoing some revisions, so we have not published a widely available system summary generator to date.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think as we move forward over the next 3 years with the National Levee Safety Program, the National Levee Database is a huge component of that program. So we want to hear ideas. We want to hear how can we make the products and tools that are associated with the National Levee Database better for better use. So if there are other types of summaries or reports, or if there's a better dashboard we can develop that's public facing, we're open and want to hear those ideas. So, again, looking forward to any suggestions over the next few years.
Thanks, Tammy. It's a question for Brian and Michael again. Is there training available for the National Levee Database?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So we have our online training documentation on the website. If you go to the help menu, this summer we're going to work on some videos and how-tos and get those posted to the website. This is in coordination with our rollout of the new National Inventory of Dams. We have a fairly robust training endeavor on that side, and we want to replicate it over to the levees too. And we can also do training one-on-one. If you contact the NLD help desk through the email, and we also have a 1-800 number, some of our support team folks can also assist one-on-one. We offer that service. Obviously, as users need a little additional help to navigate some of the more ins and outs of the system.
Thank you. This seems like a more general question, but will the national standards be flexible to account for regional differences? I assume this is related to the guidelines.
Yeah, sure. This is Tammy, and I can take that. Yes, that is one of the goals of the national guidelines, is to put forward practices that need to be adapted and scalable to the different regional differences. Absolutely.
Thank you. Carl MacArthur asks, in addition to dams and levees, there is a growing number of large flood control tunnel systems. These may have a dam component, but the tunnel system is the primary element. Are these systems currently included in one of the databases? Are there plans to include them?
So, I can chime in. I think, and Brian can certainly add, even within our agency, we have that conversation a lot, because you're right. And there's things like debris basins. There's other structures that are out there that serve some kind of compatible purpose. So we've had a lot of discussions about, a flood risk management database and things like that. I think there's not like prescriptive plans to do that, but I think it's a need and an issue that has been discussed in forums such as this often. So I think one of the ideal things that we're envisioning, even with working with FEMA, is how do we get to a place, and I think on a previous presentation, they called the future of flood risk data. How do we get to a place where we're working with we're combined national data sets? And what might that look like? So, so under the National Levee Safety Program, there's not definitive plans, but I think the issue is definitely recognized, and I think we're willing to have future discussions on how we can better get to that place of identifying all these different structures. Brian, I don't know if you have more to add with your engagement.
Yeah, I mean, specific to the dam question, obviously the new inventory dams is going to expand on the associated and appurtenant structures pieces. So they'll be a little more visible in that new system coming later this summer. And then the crosstalk between levees and dams is getting tighter as we move forward. And we're starting down the FRM route, at least on the USACE side, and starting to coalesce a lot of the flood risk management structures into a more cohesive unified database.
And this is Suzanne, I'll add. And I mean, even recently, we've had a lot of conversations between FEMA and the Corps about other types of structures. You know, maybe there's a channel or a canal, or there's a lot of different types of structures called a lot of different types of things. So getting aligned on the terminology is important, and that's what we've been trying to focus on. There's the definition of levees, I believe, that is part of the authorization of the National Levee Safety Program in the WRDA bill. So there's a lot to talk about there, but yeah, I agree. I think having a national inventory and understanding, you know, having consistent data nationwide and having a better understanding of, in cooperation with, you know, National Weather Service and NOAA, and certainly with USGS, understanding more information about the rainfall and how much water is falling in various areas and what's happening once it hits the ground and how all these different systems interact, and what digital data is available, high quality DEM data. Understanding how all of these pieces fit together is definitely a goal that we all would have as a future state, in terms of as a group of federal agencies trying to better understand flood risk and helping to communicate that to the nation. So that's something that we've been talking about a lot.
Thanks, Suzanne. Our colleague Terry Zine asks, will there be a climate change component to the program?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's definitely part of the conversation. And again, climate considerations are going to be important. How do we scope that, and what content do we need to focus on related to that is, you know, kind of an open question right now. So we look forward to, you know, again, working with the stakeholders and getting feedback on what are the most important topics we need to cover, and then how do we scope that and ensure that we have the most relevant information about that topic included. But you know, but climate we recognize is very important to the conversation.
Thank you, Tammy. Nadine Wadsworth asks, is data being shared with the Army Corps and the National Levee Database on levees as new studies occur, or as new flood studies occur?
Yes, FEMA considers the NLD as the authoritative source of consistently available data in the nation. So as we start new flood studies, new mapping studies, certainly we explore what data is available in there. We certainly leverage that as we begin to engage communities and other stakeholders to determine what additional information is available at the local level, so that we can gather all those different pieces of information and scope out that study in partnership with the state and community.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we just have 1 minute remaining, and there are a couple of recommendations or considerations for the chat, but otherwise no more questions. One of them is from Anthony Guzman. He says that the levee database should add a clarification to the engineering circular EC 1165-2-220, specifically on when a section 408 permit is required to repair levees. And Dan Frick also recommends a set of guidelines to consider, which I think we have reviewed these as part of the national program. Emergency preparedness planning, and also take a look at BMPs with respect to common items that do not follow design guidelines, yet still exist and increase risk, like encroachments, utilities, etc., and how to improve, restore robustness and resiliency, assuming they cannot simply be removed. So with that, I don't see any more questions. I want to thank all of our great presenters today for a great coherent discussion and their very clear presentations on their pretty complex topics otherwise. So thank you all very much. And thank you very much to Jacobs, our session sponsors. And thanks again to the audience. We look forward to seeing you at the rest of the conference and next in the plenary. Thank you.